When I had initially entitled today's lesson Faithful to the End, I had in mind Paul's unwavering commitment to finish the task given to him by Jesus to complete. However, as I was rereading through the passage in preparation to write the lesson, it struck me that the faithful to the end is also a description of God's help in Paul's life. Paul's life was not without its troubles, but even towards the end, as Luke writes in the final two chapters of Acts, we see God intervening through each and every difficulty. It's very apparent that as we're faithful, though we still will face trials of the world, God too will be faithful. So let's begin today with Acts 27, verses 1 to 3. When the time came, we set sail for Italy. Paul and several other prisoners were placed in the custody of a Roman officer named Julius, a captain of the imperial regiment. Aristarchus, a Macedonian from Thessalonica, was also with us. We left on a ship whose home port was Andromeda and on the northwest coast of the province of Asia. It was scheduled to make several stops at ports along the coast of the province. The next day, when we docked at Sidon, Julius was very kind to Paul and let him go ashore to visit with friends so that they could provide for his needs. So Paul is finally on his way to Rome to stand trial before Caesar after being held first by Felix, then by Festus in Caesarea for over 2 years. What had landed him under arrest in the first place? Well, if you'll remember, it was just simply the jealousy and accusations of blasphemy by the Jewish leaders who refused to believe Paul's testimony that Jesus had been the long-awaited Messiah. His circumstances could have given Paul cause to complain. Here he was a prisoner, arrested for telling the truth, for doing God's work, awaiting trial for over 2 years, now about to embark on a long and potentially dangerous journey to Rome, under guard, one of many prisoners. It was, after all, his faithfulness to God's mission that had landed him in this less than favorable situation. Luke could have written about these many possible complaints, but instead observes God faithfully at work on their behalf. From the verses we just read, how does Luke record that God is still looking out for Paul and those traveling with him? Well, Paul is permitted an exceptional favor. He's being allowed to leave the ship is an example of incredible kindness extended by the captain of the imperial regiment. Julius didn't need to let Paul off the ship to personally seek the help of his friends, but God had provided Paul with a Roman captain who was predisposed to show kindness to him. Maybe he'd become acquainted with Paul during the 2 years of imprisonment in Caesarea. He may himself have been a Christian. We don't know. What we do know is that when they docked at Sidon, Julius permitted Paul to go ashore so that his friends could provide for his coming needs. Have you ever found yourself in a difficult situation through no fault of your own? Maybe you found yourself like Paul, maligned by others' jealousy and accusations simply for remaining faithful. It would be easy to complain, and we may even feel justified to do so. But rather than go on the defensive and hosting a pity party for one, we should keep our eyes open for God's working on our behalf. And then, when we see God's intervention, we too can be thankful for his unexplained favor rather than missing it because we've been so busy grumbling. But back to Paul's story. Paul's trip to Rome turns out to be anything but smooth sailing. Right from the onset, they encounter winds that make it impossible to keep to their original charted course, and they're delayed. Luke records that it was getting dangerous for sea travel because it was getting late in the fall. Paul advises Julius to find a safe harbor to shelter in for the winter, but determined to get to Rome before then, he listens instead to the advice of the ship's captain and owner, who are looking to make one last little bit of profit before having to stow the ship for winter. They appeared to get a break when a gentle breeze began to blow, and the sailors thought they could make it by hugging the coastline. But soon a northern gale blew them out to sea, and they found themselves caught in a blinding, raging tempest for days. They tied ropes around the hull. They dropped the sea anchor. They began dumping some of the cargo and even some of the tackle to try to give the ship more buoyancy, but nothing appeared to help. It's at this point that God sends a message to Paul. Verse 21. No one had eaten for a long time. Finally, Paul called the crew together and said, "Men, you should have listened to me in the first place and not left Crete. You would have avoided all this damage and loss. But take courage. None of you will lose your lives, even though the ship will go down. For last night an angel of the Lord, to whom I belong and whom I serve, stood beside me. And he said, 'Don't be afraid, Paul, for you will surely stand trial before Caesar. What's more, God in his goodness has granted safety to everyone sailing with you. So take courage, for I believe God. It will be just as he said, and we will be shipwrecked on an island.' Here again, Paul's life has been put in jeopardy despite his own good advice. They find themselves locked in the storm for a total of 14 days. No wonder Luke records that all hope had been lost. They're desperate men facing an impossible situation, and God shows up with incredible sounding news. First, they're going to be shipwrecked. The ship and its cargo will be completely lost, but every person aboard the ship will be saved. Well, how do you think the others, all 276 on board, took Paul's news? Some, like Luke, would have believed. Julius might have been hopeful, but I suspect the vast majority were more than just a little skeptical. But see, unbeknownst to any on board at the beginning of their voyage, God had a planned pit stop for them and a divine appointment for Paul to minister. Those winds that blew them for 14 days were directing them to a destination of God's choosing. In the midst of the storm, all aboard had lost hope of surviving, but God had very different plans, and the storm he allowed them to experience was just the thing needed to redirect their course. And haven't we all experienced storms in life, difficulties that have redirected us from one destination to another? A storm is never easy, but if we choose to trust God, he shows us that the new destination provides opportunities that we would not have pursued or even dreamed of if we'd stayed on a clear course. Think about it. What causes us to change? When all seems to be going well, or when we hit a difficulty? Admit it. When everything is smooth sailing, we sail on, often unthinkingly, content to go with the flow. It's when we find ourselves in over our heads that we get serious about seeking God's direction. It's human nature, and we share the same predisposition. So sometimes God must introduce a little turbulence to our life, not to harm us, but to set us on his course. So, what of Paul and his shipmates? What course does God have them on? Well, after his news, they still find themselves fighting for their lives. And at about midnight, the sailors take sound readings and discover that the ship is rapidly advancing to a shallower sea level, and they become fearful of becoming shipwrecked, even though Paul has told them that is exactly what God has planned. The sailors try to abandon ship on the lifeboat, but the soldiers cut the lines when Paul warns that those aboard cannot hope to survive if even one person deserts. Paul encourages everyone to eat. It's been 2 weeks since anyone has had a decent meal, and they've probably lost anything that had been on their stomachs during the extended period of their churning in the storm. He takes some bread, thanks God for it, and eats, which encourages the others to do likewise. Then, after eating what feels like it must have been their last meal, they toss the remaining cargo of wheat overboard to further lighten the load. When morning came, they actually saw a coastline, but they didn't recognize it. It had a bay and a beach area, and they decided to go for it. They cut the anchors, but soon the ship became irretrievably stuck in a sandbar. Julius again comes to Paul's rescue. His soldiers want to kill all the prisoners to prevent them from escaping on the island. You have to remember, it's their lives, the soldiers' lives, that are at stake if any one of their prisoners escapes. But Julius refuses to let them carry out their plan. Everyone is encouraged to swim ashore or grab onto something to float their way to land. And guess what? Just as Paul had told them, everyone survives. But Paul's excitement isn't over. Chapter 28, verse 1. Once we were safe on shore, we learned that we were on the island of Malta. The people of the island were very kind to us. It was cold and rainy, so they built a fire on the shore to welcome us. As Paul gathered an armful of sticks and was laying them on the fire, a poisonous snake, driven out by the heat, bit him on the hand. The people of the island saw it hanging from his hand and said to each other, "A murderer, no doubt. Though he escaped the sea, justice will not permit him to live." But Paul shook off the snake into the fire and was unharmed. The people waited for him to swell up or suddenly drop dead. But when they had waited a long time and saw he wasn't harmed, they changed their minds and decided he must be a god. There's no doubt that the snake that bit Paul should have killed him. The islanders fully expected him to keel over at any moment, And when he didn't, they believed him to be a god, impervious to such things. No human had ever survived the bite of that particular viper, to the locals' knowledge. But it appears that Paul remains completely oblivious. After being bitten, he shakes the snake off into the fire and continues to help out as he's able. It's not his lack of knowledge or understanding of this particular snake that saves him. It's God. He's completely unaware of the danger his life is in, but God intervenes, and what should have been a deadly encounter is nothing more than a nuisance. I will guarantee that there have been times in your own life that you have been equally oblivious to a danger that God has protected you from. I'll give you an example from my own life. When I was 17 years old, I moved into my grandmother's home in Brampton. I got a job working at a Tim Hortons, about a 30-minute walk or 5-minute bike ride away from where I was living. Within 3 months, I was given the role of supervisor of the afternoon shift, starting at 3 in the afternoon, but ending at 11 p.m. Going to work was generally uneventful, but my trip home took me through the heart of downtown, which, looking back on it now, was not the safest thing to do. I can remember being followed on at least one occasion. I remember having to cut through less than sober crowds on the sidewalk. I can remember unwanted attention as I made my way home. But never once over the course of a year and a half did I ever have anyone attempt to harm me. Was I just too intimidating? Tall, skinny, 17-year-old? Not likely. Lucky? I don't think so. I believe God prevented harm coming to me, even though I found myself in situations where I could have easily been in trouble. I do wonder now that I'm older and hopefully wiser, if I didn't have some company walking alongside that I was unaware of. But maybe their presence was felt by others. Maybe a little angelic backup. And how many other times have I experienced God's intervention and been unaware? Too many to count, I dare say. And I suspect each of you have too. So it was with Paul. He's bitten by a snake and kept perfectly not dead by God. So afterward, the group, including Paul and Luke, are treated as guests at the home of Publius, the governor of the island, over the next 3 days. They learn that Publius' father is very ill, so Paul prays for him and he's healed, which of course results in many sick people being brought to Paul over the next 3 months, both to receive healing and to hear the good news about Jesus. God's divine appointment. And after 3 months, they're able to sail again, and Paul finally arrives in Rome to remain a prisoner until he's given an audience with Caesar, which is where we discover another example of God's faithfulness to Paul in response to Paul's faithfulness to God. In verses 30 and 31, we read, "For the next 2 years, Paul lived in Rome at his own expense. He welcomed all who visited him, boldly proclaiming the kingdom of God and teaching about the Lord Jesus Christ. And no one tried to stop him." Yes, Paul was a prisoner. He was guarded 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. He was not free to leave his home. So how was he free? Paul remained free to minister. No one stopped him. He was free to have friends visit and to stay in his own accommodations. Rather than dwelling on his limitations, Paul made the most of his freedom. Too many of us, rather than recognizing the good things God has already provided for us, get caught up focusing on the things he hasn't. Paul could have grumbled about his limitations and would have lost his effectiveness to continue in his ministry. Instead, he found ways to work within those limitations, and many more people heard about Jesus as a result. We all have things that limit us, whether physical condition, age, income, education, past mistakes, to name just a few. But those do not present limitations to God. The greatest and most damning limitation we can place on our own lives is to refuse to see the freedom we do possess. Freedom that allows us to serve God just as we are and whatever circumstances he leads us to. Paul's life, and especially the events recorded in the last 2 chapters of Acts that we've examined today, demonstrate that God's presence is very much with us, even in the midst of trouble. God is faithful, and even though we don't always recognize his hand at work, we can trust him. Just to recap these last 2 chapters, we know from Paul's life, though he was wrongly accused, Paul met with favor from an unlikely source, the captain of the Roman imperial regiment. Though shipwrecked, Paul and everyone with him survived, and an entire island of people was given the opportunity to learn about Jesus' work and forgiveness, as well as experience God's power at work through Paul to heal them. Though exposed to death through the bite of a serpent, Paul remained unaware of the danger as God protected him from its venom. And finally, though incarcerated and unable to travel about freely, he remained free to minister to all who sought him out. When you find yourself in less than ideal circumstances, take a page from Paul's life. Rather than being consumed by the unjust accusations of others, the raging storms of life, the unseen dangers and limitations, look for God to be faithful in providing favor from unlikely sources, new opportunities because of the storms, freedom amidst limitations, and the promised gift of his care, even when we don't see it.